Alone in a truck stop at 1 a.m., I thought I was safe, until I woke to find a stranger in my cab, holding a knife. There was a time I'd call myself a seasoned driver. I'd been on the road a long time, too long probably, spending more hours on the interstate than at home. I thought I'd seen it all the strange and unpredictable things that can happen when you live behind the wheel. But one night, somewhere in the middle of nowhere, I learned just how wrong I was. I'd been driving all day, winding through Texas with the final destination clear across Arizona. It was a long haul, and I'd stretched the day as far as I could, tired but stubborn to get a few more hours behind me before pulling over. The landscape outside was flat and empty, punctuated only by the random brush and fencing that stretched alongside the lonely road. Around 1 a.m., I finally felt myself fading. I had to stop even though the only place in sight was a rundown truck stop. The neon lights outside flickered and buzzed, casting a sickly yellow glow over the empty pumps. The whole place looked like it hadn't seen business in years. I parked and stepped out, stretching a bit and taking in the eeriness of the deserted lot. There was something in the air, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Usually there'd be other trucks around, but this place was empty. I chalked it up to just another forgotten stop on a forgotten stretch of road, the kind of place that falls off the map. I figured I'd take a quick nap and push through the rest of the way, so I climbed back into the cab and locked the doors. I drifted off fast, that dead kind of sleep where you don't dream, and you're not even aware you're out. But then, something pulled me from it. I was still groggy, trying to remember where I was. It was pitch dark outside, and everything was quiet. Too quiet. I leaned back to relax, thinking it was just nerves, when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. There was someone standing by the side of my truck. The guy had a backpack slung over his shoulder, and he was just standing there. He didn't look like he was stranded or in trouble. He just stood by my cab, still as a statue, watching. I immediately locked eyes with him through the window, but he didn't even flinch. Just kept staring. He didn't seem like a drifter or a hitchhiker. He looked like he'd been standing there for hours, maybe even waiting for me. My stomach churned with something like fear, but I brushed it off. You see all kinds of people on the road, and not all of them are bad news. I sat there, staring back, hoping he'd get the message and move along. I could see his face now in the dim light from the truck's dash. There was something blank in his expression, like he wasn't really looking at me at all, but through me. It gave me a chill, one I couldn't shake, even after I closed my eyes and leaned back. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening, every sound amplified by the silence around me. But then, I must have dozed off again because, when I opened my eyes, he was gone. I let out a sigh, trying to shake off the unease. Maybe he was just some guy looking for a place to sleep, maybe just a loner who liked wandering. But I couldn't settle, not really, and part of me wanted to start up the truck and get moving again, leave that place behind me. My head felt heavy and my body demanded rest, so I tried again to sleep. The next time I woke, I wasn't alone. He was inside my cab, inches from my face. His hand was holding a knife, and the sight of it was like an ice-cold shot straight to my gut. My breath caught, but he didn't say a word. He didn't have to. His expression told me everything. He was in control now. Slowly, he motioned for me to move over into the passenger seat, and I obeyed, too stunned to do anything else. My mind raced, wondering how he got in, why he was doing this, what he wanted from me. He climbed into the driver's seat, took hold of the wheel, and started the engine. I hadn't even thought to leave the keys out of the ignition. I cursed myself silently, but it didn't matter now. We were already moving. He kept his eyes on the road, silent, while I sat next to him, helpless. The highway stretched on endlessly in front of us, mile after mile of nothing but empty road. We drove for hours. It was like I was in some kind of trance, frozen and numb. I kept glancing at him, at the knife in his lap, the only thing breaking the silence between us. Every so often I'd open my mouth to ask him something, anything, but the words just wouldn't come. All I could do was watch the dark, unfamiliar terrain roll by, completely at his mercy. Eventually, we veered off the main road onto a narrow, winding path that led us further into the middle of nowhere. The truck rocked and bounced over potholes and dirt, every jolt making my heart pound. I wanted to ask him where we were going, why he was taking me here, but there was no point. He wasn't going to answer. This guy didn't seem like he was interested in conversation. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we stopped. I looked out and my stomach dropped. We were in front of an old barn, half collapsed and surrounded by nothing but overgrown weeds and brush. It looked abandoned, like it hadn't been touched in decades. He motioned for me to get out, and I hesitated. But then he gave me this look, this cold, empty stare, and I obeyed. I stepped out into the silence, and he followed, still clutching that knife, his other hand tightly gripping his backpack. I thought maybe this was it. I braced myself, every nerve in my body on high alert. But instead of coming toward me, he walked toward the barn. He didn't look back. He didn't say a single word. He just kept walking until he disappeared inside, leaving me standing there in the night, utterly alone. I didn't stick around to see what happened next. I practically stumbled back to the truck, my hands shaking as I climbed in and threw it into reverse. My mind was a mess, thoughts colliding in a rush of fear and confusion. But all I cared about was getting out of there, putting as much distance as possible between me and that barn. The truck roared as I tore down the dirt path, kicking up clouds of dust behind me. I didn't stop until I reached a busy truck stop several towns over, where I finally allowed myself to breathe. I sat there, in the driver's seat, staring out the window into the lights and the people around me, as the reality of what had just happened settled in. I got stranded in the middle of nowhere after my truck got stolen and barely made it out. I never thought my last trip as a trucker would end this way. I've been on the road for decades, seen my share of close calls, but nothing like what happened to me outside a tiny place called Aztec, New Mexico. I was heading out for what I'd planned to be my final solo haul, a simple nighttime drive from Albuquerque up through the Four Corners. I'd made this trip dozens of times, but somehow, that night, the open road felt different. The first few hours were uneventful. Deserted highways, empty rest stops, just the glow of the occasional gas station sign in the distance. My truck was fully loaded, nothing valuable, just some parts and materials. I wasn't in a rush, and the night was calm, almost eerie in that dry, quiet way New Mexico has in the middle of the night. As the miles rolled by, my mind wandered, half listening to an old, classic rock station that crackled in and out on the radio. I'd planned to make it through the night without stopping, but around midnight, my fuel gauge told me I wouldn't make it much further without a refill. That's when I spotted an old gas station off the main highway. It was one of those places that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s. Fluorescent lights buzzed weakly above a single pump, casting an uncomfortable green hue over the cracked pavement. The place was deserted. Even the payphone was covered in graffiti, clearly out of service. But the pump was functional, and at that hour, that's all I cared about. As I finished fueling up, I noticed a guy standing off to the side of the building, half hidden in the shadows. He looked like he was in his 50s, rugged and a bit rough around the edges, the kind of guy you might expect to see working in a garage. I'd thought I was alone, so seeing him standing there took me by surprise. He walked up to me, said he was a mechanic, and that he'd noticed something was wrong with my brakes. Now I'd done my pre-checks. Everything had looked fine, but he seemed insistent. I've been around enough trucks to know better than to ignore potential issues, especially when someone who looked like he'd seen the underside of a few trucks tells me there's something wrong. I thanked him, told him I'd check it out, and figured I might as well grab a snack from a diner I'd seen a couple of miles back on my GPS. The diner was small, one of those places that barely shows up on a map, but it was open, and the sight of warm lights and people was strangely comforting after hours of isolation on the road. Inside, there were just a few night owls, a waitress who looked as tired as I felt, a couple of guys hunched over at the bar counter, and the smell of stale coffee and greasy food hanging in the air. I ordered a sandwich, hoping to take it back to the mechanic as a small thanks for his heads up about the brakes. The sandwich took longer than I expected, and I found myself looking out the window, thinking about how quiet it was out there in the dead of night. The lights in the parking lot created odd shadows that made the whole place feel uneasy. My eyes kept flicking to the clock, watching the minutes crawl by. When the sandwich finally came, I paid, grabbed the bag, and headed back to the gas station. The road felt darker than before, and the drive back took longer than it should have, like the night itself had grown heavier. When I got to the station, I stopped short, frozen by what I was seeing. My truck was gone. Just gone, like it had never been there. At first, I thought maybe I'd parked it somewhere else, my tired mind playing tricks on me. But after a few frantic minutes of running around the station, it was clear. My rig, my trailer, everything was gone. The mechanic was nowhere in sight, of course, and a sinking feeling hit me. I'd been scammed, and it hadn't even crossed my mind. My phone was in my pocket, so I immediately tried to call dispatch. The signal was spotty, and it took several tries to get through. When I finally did, they didn't even sound surprised. They told me this was a known scam in the area, a coordinated effort to target truckers in remote places, sometimes posing as mechanics, sometimes as gas station attendants, always using different tricks to catch drivers off guard. Dispatch confirmed the worst part. These trucks were never found again. They'd be stripped down, painted, parts swapped, and sold off across state lines, like ghosts that had never existed. And here I was, stranded in the middle of New Mexico with just my phone, wallet, and a half-cold sandwich. I looked around, and reality started sinking in. The station was pitch black, aside from a single light bulb by the door. There were no cars, no sign of life, and just a long, empty road stretching in both directions. The nearest town was miles away, and the station itself looked abandoned, the paint peeling off the walls, half the windows broken. I stood there, alone under the flickering light, the night silent and heavy, pressing down on me. There's a special kind of fear that grips you when you're stranded in a place that seems entirely forgotten. I felt exposed, vulnerable in a way I hadn't experienced in years. My only option was to start walking, but every step felt like I was going deeper into a trap, like something was waiting just out of sight. I headed down the road, sticking close to the edge, listening for any sounds. The night seemed to swallow everything around me, and even my own footsteps felt muted, like they weren't supposed to be there. The desert stretched out on both sides, an endless sea of black with no signs of life. Every once in a while, I'd think I heard something, a crunch of gravel, a rustle in the brush. But every time I stopped and turned, there was nothing. Just the vast, empty night. After what felt like hours of walking, I finally saw a faint light ahead. My heart leapt, thinking it might be a house, a passing car. Anything. But as I got closer, I realized it was just another abandoned building, a relic from a time when these roads saw more traffic. I tried the door, but it was locked, and the windows were boarded up. I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath, wondering how much longer I'd be stuck out there. Then, just when I'd given up hope of seeing anyone, I heard an engine. I whipped around, the beam of headlights cutting through the darkness like a lifeline. A car was coming down the road, moving slowly, almost cautiously. I waved my arms, practically throwing myself into the road to get their attention. The car pulled over, an older sedan with faded paint and a driver who looked as tired and worn as the car itself. He cracked the window, giving me a wary look, probably wondering if I was trouble. I explained what had happened, and after a few tense moments, he let me in. The drive back to town was silent, the driver barely saying a word, just glancing at me every so often, as if trying to piece together what had happened. I didn't blame him. I could hardly believe it myself. When we finally reached a gas station back in Aztec, I thanked him, and he nodded, pulling away without another word. I sat in that gas station, nursing a cold coffee, waiting for someone from dispatch to pick me up. The fluorescent lights felt harsh, almost too real after the long, dark road. Hours passed, and I watched the sun rise through the dusty windows, feeling like I'd barely escaped something I couldn't even name. I'd been robbed, left in the middle of nowhere, and somehow I'd made it out. What happened to me at a rest area in the middle of nowhere still freaks me out. I've been driving trucks long enough to know what's risky out there, or at least I thought I did. But nothing really prepares you for the moments when things go sideways in a way you didn't see coming. This happened about 2 years ago, and it's the reason I don't take late-night runs through remote areas unless I absolutely have to. I was on a haul from Phoenix to Albuquerque, making good time through some seriously empty stretches of highway. You get used to the isolation out there, the only company being scattered headlights in the distance every now and then. It was around 1:30 in the morning, and I was already pushing it, trying to get as close to my destination as possible before stopping for a few hours' sleep. My body was telling me it was time for a break, though, so I figured I'd stop and stretch my legs at a rest area I knew was coming up. The place was exactly what you'd expect from a roadside pull-off in the middle of the desert. One light flickering over the parking area, casting weird shadows, and a couple of bathrooms that looked like they hadn't been cleaned in years. There was only one other vehicle, a beat-up sedan parked near the bathrooms. Nobody was around, and no one seemed to be in the car. Maybe they were sleeping, or maybe they'd wandered off into the desert for all I knew. But it didn't matter. I was just there to stretch my legs and check the truck. As I circled the rig, I noticed that my trailer's right taillight was broken. Just my luck, especially on a dark highway where other drivers can barely see you even with everything working. I had a spare light in the cab, so I figured I'd fix it then and there to avoid any trouble later on. I grabbed my tools and set up at the back of the trailer, checking to make sure the wires were still connected. The silence around me was unsettling. Out in the desert at night, every sound is magnified. The wind, a distant animal, maybe the occasional rustle of brush. But there was none of that. Just dead quiet. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. Not loud, just this faint crunching on the gravel. I froze, holding my breath as the footsteps got closer. At first, I thought it might be the driver of the sedan coming over to ask for help or maybe just some conversation, but when I turned around, there were 2 men, both around my age or a little younger, standing a few feet away. They looked rough, like they'd been on the road for days without a shower or sleep. One was holding something. At first, I thought it was a wrench or some kind of tool, but it was a small, dull knife. I was alone, isolated and cornered with these guys sizing me up. I didn't make any sudden moves, hoping they'd just ask for a few bucks and move on. But they didn't seem interested in a simple handout. One of them took a step forward, locking eyes with me, while the other kept glancing around, maybe checking to see if anyone else was coming. I've been in tight spots before, but this was different. These guys didn't look desperate. They looked like they knew exactly what they were doing. They gestured toward my wallet and I handed it over, figuring they'd take the cash and leave. I only had about $50 in it, so I figured I'd just take the loss and get out of there. But they weren't satisfied. They went through my wallet, tossing out cards, receipts, and everything else like they were searching for something specific. When one of them glanced up, he gave me this look, cold, calculating, as if he was deciding what else they could take from me. They took a step closer, backing me up against the side of my trailer. I was trapped, and it dawned on me that this wasn't just a quick grab-and-go robbery. One of them told me to hand over anything else valuable, pointing that dull knife right at me. I didn't have anything else on me, so I motioned toward the cab, hoping they'd just go rummage through the truck and leave me alone. But instead of heading for the cab, one of them shoved me hard against the trailer. The other kept glancing over his shoulder, keeping an eye on the rest area as if they expected someone to drive up any second. I could feel the sharp edge of the trailer digging into my back, and all I could think about was how isolated this place was. I was alone with two guys who clearly weren't afraid to get violent if it came down to it. I didn't know if they were armed beyond the knife, but the way they held themselves made it clear they had a plan, and it didn't involve leaving me alone in one piece. They started rifling through my pockets, going for my phone, keys, anything they could find. I tried to keep calm, but it was almost impossible with that knife so close. After emptying my pockets, one of them nodded toward my cab, motioning me to unlock it. I thought about making a break for it, but I knew they'd probably catch up in seconds. So I walked over slowly, unlocked the door, and stepped aside as they climbed in. They were in there for what felt like hours, tearing through my things, muttering to each other in low voices. I could hear the faint clinking of metal as they rummaged through my tools, likely looking for anything they could pawn or trade. I kept my distance, trying to stay out of sight while keeping an eye on them, hoping they'd get bored or satisfied and just leave. Eventually, they climbed out, each holding a handful of things they'd taken from the cab. I didn't care about the stuff. They could have it all if it meant they'd just walk away. But instead of leaving, they turned back to me, as if they weren't done yet. One of them gestured toward the trailer and said something I couldn't make out, but it sounded like he was asking if I was hauling anything valuable. I shook my head, trying to convince them it was just a load of standard goods, nothing they'd want. But they didn't look convinced. One of them started toward the back of the trailer, motioning for me to unlock it. I tried to explain that I didn't have the key on me, that the lock was company issued and I couldn't open it without a code, but they didn't believe me. I was sure they'd just pry it open or try to force their way in, but at that moment, headlights appeared in the distance, lighting up the rest area just enough to make them nervous. They looked at each other, muttering under their breath, and I thought they'd finally take off. But one of them grabbed my arm, squeezing hard enough that I could feel the bones in my wrist. He gave me this look, a warning, like he was telling me that if I ever mentioned this to anyone, they'd come back for me. Finally, they let go, heading back toward the sedan. I watched as they drove off into the night, their taillights disappearing over the rise of the road. It was only then that I realized I'd been holding my breath. and my heart was pounding so hard I thought I'd pass out. I stood there in the dark for what felt like hours, just trying to process what had happened. Eventually, I got back into my cab, locking the doors and checking every inch of the truck to see what they'd taken. They'd managed to grab a few tools, my phone charger, and some of my personal belongings. But it wasn't the loss of stuff that bothered me. It was the feeling of being cornered, completely helpless in a place where no one could hear me if I screamed. The entire drive to Albuquerque, I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced they'd come back, that I'd see their headlights following me down that endless stretch of road. I was driving through the desert when I realized I was being followed for miles. I was on my usual route, driving from Flagstaff, Arizona, down to Phoenix. I know that road well. It's mostly desert, with stretches where you don't see another soul for miles. The first few hours went by without a hitch, just mile after mile of desert rolling past. It was a clear night, but pitch black. The only light was from my truck and the occasional reflector marking the side of the road. I was maybe an hour outside of Flagstaff when I noticed a car parked on the shoulder, its hazard lights flashing. Normally, I might not have thought twice about it. But it was so late, and the road was so empty, that the sight of another vehicle, especially one that seemed stranded, caught my attention. I slowed down a little as I passed, craning my neck to see if anyone was around, but I didn't spot a driver. Something about it struck me as off. There wasn't a town or even a gas station anywhere nearby, and the car looked out of place sitting there alone. Still, I told myself it was probably someone with car trouble waiting for help, and I kept driving, trying to shake off the weird feeling the sight of the car had given me. But a few minutes later, I checked my mirror, and there it was. The same car, now moving, its headlights bouncing along as it sped up to catch up with me. I wasn't sure how long it had been back there, but now it was keeping a steady distance behind me. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe they'd just managed to fix their car or had been waiting for someone to bring them gas. It's not uncommon out in the desert where breakdowns happen all the time. But the more I drove, the more I realized this car wasn't trying to pass me. It was just hanging there, right in my rear view, matching my speed exactly. I picked up the pace a little, hoping they'd fall back or speed up and pass me, but they didn't. Instead, they just stuck to my tail, always at the same distance. I was trying to stay calm, but a part of me couldn't shake this nagging feeling that something was very wrong. I wasn't used to other cars acting like this, especially not in the middle of the night on an empty road. After about 10 minutes of this strange cat and mouse game, I finally thought I'd lose them. I slowed down, hoping they'd either pass or stop, but they just stayed put, keeping that same unnerving distance. It was as if they were trying to keep themselves right in my line of sight. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, even though I kept telling myself it was probably nothing. But I'd been driving long enough to know this wasn't normal. I tried focusing on the road, figuring that if I just kept driving, I'd eventually reach the outskirts of Phoenix where there'd be more people, more lights, and places to stop. But the longer I drove, the more relentless they seemed. They'd speed up if I sped up, slow down if I slowed down. It felt like some strange game, one I hadn't agreed to play. I gripped the wheel tighter, my eyes darting from the road ahead to the mirror, trying to catch a clearer look at whoever was driving. After what felt like an eternity, I spotted the faint glow of a small gas station up ahead. It was one of those places that looked like it hadn't been remodeled since the 70s. But it was lit, and that was good enough for me. I figured if I pulled in, maybe the other driver would finally go on their way. I signaled, changed lanes, and headed toward the station, keeping an eye on my mirror. To my relief, the car stayed on the highway, finally passing me and disappearing down the dark road. I breathed a sigh of relief as I pulled into the gas station lot, feeling silly for getting so worked up. But as I sat there, my hand still gripping the wheel, I realized I was shaking. I decided to stretch my legs, buy a drink, and take a breather before hitting the road again. I watched the road, half expecting that car to come back, but everything seemed quiet. I bought a soda, lingered by the counter for a bit, and eventually felt like I could head back out. I climbed into my truck, took a deep breath, and pulled back onto the road, hoping the rest of the drive would be as calm as it had started. But barely 5 minutes later, I saw them again. Same car, now parked on the shoulder, hazards flashing. It was the same spot I'd seen them at earlier, and the exact same setup. Just the car, lights flashing, no sign of a driver. My stomach twisted. It didn't make sense. How could they have gotten back here, and why? I slowed down slightly, trying to get a better look, but as I passed, the car stayed dark. I kept driving, my eyes glued to the rear view, waiting for them to pull out and follow me again. At first, nothing happened, and I thought maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe it was just some weird coincidence. But then, just as I was about to convince myself it was all in my head, the headlights popped on behind me. They were following me again, keeping that same steady distance. My pulse started racing, and this time I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever was behind the wheel wasn't just out for a drive. I wanted to pull over to turn around, but I couldn't risk stopping, not with this car hanging back there like a shadow. This continued for miles. Every time I thought they'd finally left, they'd pop up again, either on the shoulder or in my mirror, always at the same unnerving distance. It was like they were playing with me, pushing me to see how long I could take it. I knew there was nowhere to turn off until I reached the next town, and I was stuck in this bizarre game, counting the miles until I could finally pull over in a safe spot. Eventually, the lights of the next town came into view. I could see a 24-hour diner up ahead, its neon sign glowing like a beacon. I signaled, pulled into the lot, and parked near the entrance. I glanced in my mirror, expecting to see the car pass, but this time they didn't. They pulled in behind me, parking in the far corner of the lot. I could see their headlights dim, the silhouette of the car barely visible in the shadows. I kept my eyes on them, waiting for them to make a move, but nothing happened. I sat there, engine running, watching the darkened car in my mirror. It was the longest few minutes of my life. They just sat there, never getting out, never turning off the car, just parked. I was on edge, feeling like I was stuck in some nightmare, unable to move or breathe. The diner's lights flickered above me, casting a dim glow over the lot, but it didn't make me feel any safer. I could feel my pulse racing, my mind scrambling for a way out. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they backed out of the lot, slowly turning back onto the highway. I watched as their taillights faded into the darkness, leaving me alone in the parking lot. I stayed there for a while, waiting, half expecting them to come back, but the road remained empty. I've never felt relief like I did that night, and it took me a while before I could get back on the road. I broke the cardinal rule and picked up hitchhikers, only to find myself a hostage in my own cab with no way out and no one around for miles. I was always told that you should never pick up hitchhikers, especially if you're driving a long-haul truck at night. But that night, driving through the middle of nowhere on Highway 93 between Kingman and Phoenix, I made the mistake of ignoring that advice. It was late. I was tired. And I was just looking forward to getting to my stop. But sometimes, One small decision can throw you into a situation you'd never thought you'd find yourself in. I was about an hour into Arizona, driving along an empty stretch of road surrounded by nothing but flat desert and the occasional tumbleweed. It was around midnight, and there hadn't been another car in sight for miles. That's when I spotted two people up ahead, waving from the shoulder. They looked like a young couple, early 20s maybe, with a backpack and a couple of duffel bags. The guy looked worn out, and the girl had her arms wrapped around herself, shivering despite the warm night air. Something about it didn't feel right, but I tried to reason with myself. Maybe they were stranded, maybe they'd run out of gas, maybe I was just being paranoid. Against my better judgment, I slowed down and pulled over. I figured I could at least hear them out. They climbed up into the cab, thanking me over and over, telling me their car had broken down a ways back and they'd been trying to get a ride for hours. They just needed a lift to the next town, which was about 40 miles up the road. They looked worn out, and I felt a little sorry for them. Besides, it wasn't like they looked dangerous. Just a couple of kids who had hit a rough patch. I started the truck up again, merging back onto the road, telling myself I was just doing a good deed. But things started to feel off pretty quick. They didn't talk much, and when they did, it was short, clipped answers. The guy, who was sitting closest to me, kept shifting in his seat, glancing at the girl and then back at me. I figured maybe they were just tired or uncomfortable being in a stranger's truck. Still, I couldn't help but feel tense. Something in their body language was setting off alarms in my head. We'd been driving for about 15 minutes, and the silence in the cab was getting heavier by the second. I was trying to focus on the road, but I could feel the guy staring at me from the corner of his eye. Finally, he asked me if I had any cash. I glanced over at him, and his face had changed. That friendly, grateful expression from earlier was gone. Now he was looking at me with this cold, hard look that made my skin crawl. I told him I didn't carry much cash, just a few dollars for snacks and coffee. He just nodded, not breaking eye contact. Then he asked if I had a weapon, and I felt my stomach drop. It was such an odd, unexpected question that I couldn't even respond at first. I was starting to realize just how big a mistake I'd made letting them into my truck. Before I could react, he pulled something out of his jacket. It wasn't a gun, but it was a knife, a long, ugly thing with a blade that caught the dim light from the dash. He held it in his hand, resting it on his leg, not even looking at it, just keeping his eyes locked on mine. I tried to stay calm, keep my voice steady as I asked him what he wanted. He didn't answer, just gave me this smile that sent a chill down my spine. The girl hadn't said a word since they got in, and now she was just staring out the window, her face blank, like she was somewhere else entirely. I was trapped with nowhere to go and no one around for miles. The cab of my truck suddenly felt like a cage. The guy leaned closer, lowering his voice, telling me to keep driving, that they just needed a ride a little further. I nodded, barely able to keep my hand steady on the wheel. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how to get out of this without getting hurt. Every scenario I ran through in my head ended badly. I could feel the sweat running down my back, soaking into my shirt. We drove like that for what felt like an eternity. Just me, the two strangers, and the knife resting on his lap. The girl still hadn't said a word, and I started to wonder if she was really scared or if this was just part of some twisted act. I kept glancing at the GPS, counting down the miles to the next town, hoping maybe I'd see some lights or a gas station where I could pull over, but the road was just endless darkness. The guy must have noticed because he told me to stop looking around, to just keep my eyes on the road. Eventually, He told me to pull off onto a small dirt road. I had no idea where we were, just that we were miles from anywhere remotely populated. My heart was pounding, every instinct screaming at me not to stop, but I didn't have much of a choice. I pulled off, the truck bouncing along the uneven dirt, and he told me to stop once we were far enough off the main road. My headlights lit up the barren landscape. A few scattered rocks, some low shrubs, and nothing else. He told me to turn off the truck, and I did. The silence that followed was suffocating. I could hear every breath, every rustle of clothing. The girl finally moved, reaching into one of their bags and pulling out a piece of rope. She tossed it to the guy, who handed me the end, nodding toward my wrists. He didn't have to say anything. I knew what he wanted. I didn't want to imagine where this was going, but I didn't see a way out. I tried to reason with him, told him he could take whatever he wanted, that I wouldn't report them if they'd just let me go. He just looked at me, that cold, lifeless smile never leaving his face. He told me to tie my hands, and when I hesitated, he held the knife up, close enough that I could see every scratch on the blade. I tied the rope around my wrists, feeling the rough fibers bite into my skin. He told me to lie down in the cab, pressing the knife against my side as a reminder. I did as he said, trying to keep my breathing steady. The girl was rifling through my belongings, going through every compartment, pocket, and drawer, pulling out anything that looked remotely valuable. They didn't find much, just some cash, my phone, and a few personal items. The guy seemed disappointed, but he didn't say anything. When they'd taken everything they could, he told me to sit up. He watched me carefully, and for a moment I thought he might actually let me go. But then he shook his head, telling me they couldn't have me calling anyone before they got far enough away. He told the girl to grab one of my blankets, and she tossed it to him. He wrapped it around my head, tight enough to block my vision, and told me to count to 100 before moving. I heard them climb down from the cab, heard their footsteps fading into the distance, and then nothing. I started counting, my heart pounding so hard I could barely keep track of the numbers. When I finally hit 100, I pulled the blanket off and looked around, but they were gone, vanished into the desert night with everything I had. I sat there for a while, too stunned to move, half expecting them to come back. When I finally felt like it was safe, I started the truck and got back onto the highway. It was a long, tense drive to the next town, where I pulled into a gas station and called the cops. They took my statement, but it didn't feel like they expected much to come of it. Out there in the middle of nowhere, things like this just happened, and there was little anyone could do about it. The whole experience left me rattled. I'd always thought I could handle anything that came my way, but that night taught me how quickly things can spiral out of control. Now, I don't stop for anyone, no matter how stranded they look. Let me tell you about one of the most unsettling experiences I've had on the road, out there alone for days on end. I've been trucking for almost a decade, and I've seen it all. Odd encounters, weird towns, the eerie, quiet stretches where you swear something's wrong. But there's one experience that's stuck with me, the kind of thing I still can't shake when I'm passing through certain places. This wasn't something paranormal, no aliens or ghosts. This was something worse, I guess, because it was so real. It was late November, the kind of late fall that feels like winter's fully moved in already. I was hauling a load from Seattle down to Denver, following a long, quiet route through Wyoming. These drives are usually the best, at least in terms of avoiding traffic. I like the open roads, but Wyoming has this desolation to it, a sort of remoteness that's different from any other state. For most people, it'd be unnerving, but for a trucker like me, it's comforting. The wide open land, the empty skies. It usually clears my head. but that night something felt off. I was rolling down a lonely highway, no lights in sight, no other cars, just miles of dark stretches. Sometime after midnight, I reached a little truck stop near Medicine Bow, Wyoming. It was mostly deserted, with a single rusty pump and a flickering neon light that looked like it hadn't worked right in decades. I needed to stretch my legs, maybe get some caffeine to keep my eyes open. There was a single car parked there, an old, beaten-up Buick that looked abandoned. I didn't think much of it. Sometimes cars break down, and people leave them in places like that. As I walked into the small shop, the clerk was an old man, huddled behind the counter with his back to me. The bell above the door barely jingled as I entered, and for a second, it was like he didn't even notice me. I remember the air inside felt different, like it was stale or something. The old man finally turned around, gave me a nod, but didn't say anything. His face looked rough, like he'd been out in the sun too long, or maybe he'd just seen too much of life. I grabbed a coffee, paid, and he just stared at me the whole time, a strange, blank expression. There was this moment where I felt like he wanted to say something, but he never did, just nodded when I handed him the cash. I didn't think much of it, chalking it up to small-town weirdness, and went back out to the truck. I got back on the road, and after a few minutes, the strange feeling started to fade. I brushed it off as just me being overtired. About an hour later, I was still driving through the empty stretches of highway when I noticed something odd in my mirrors. There were headlights in the distance, way back, barely visible. It was strange because I hadn't seen another car in hours, and the lights were steady, not gaining on me, just sitting there in the distance. The road was dark, flat, and open, so there's no way I wouldn't have noticed them approaching. They must have turned onto the road from a side path or something. It crossed my mind that maybe they were just someone else out late, but the feeling from the truck stop crept back in. The lights stayed steady, hovering far enough back that it felt intentional. Another hour passed, and those lights didn't go away. They didn't get closer either, just this constant presence behind me. Every so often I'd glance back, hoping to see them fade out of sight, but they didn't. They were like a specter back there, just lingering. I got this itching feeling at the back of my neck, the kind you get when something's not right. My fingers were tight around the wheel. I was trying to rationalize it, like maybe it was another trucker or someone in an old car that couldn't go too fast. But then, why didn't they just pass me? After hours of this, I finally saw a small diner off the highway and pulled in, hoping to lose them. The place was empty, but the lights were on, and the sign outside flickered. 24 hours. I figured I'd grab a bite, maybe let whoever was behind me pass. As I walked inside, the waitress, an older lady with tired eyes and a stained apron, gave me a half-hearted smile. She took my order without much conversation, and I sat down, hoping to put some distance between me and that car. I kept glancing outside, half expecting to see those lights still lingering there, but the parking lot stayed empty. When my food came, I ate quickly, the whole time just feeling a bit on edge. I don't usually rush through meals, but something about that night made me want to get moving. When I finally got back to the truck, I noticed my fuel gauge had dropped way lower than it should have. I knew I'd filled up at that last stop. The thing is, fuel gauges don't just drop like that out of nowhere. It was strange, but I didn't have time to think too much on it. I figured maybe I'd miscalculated. Back on the highway, I let myself relax a bit. The diner felt like a safe break in the long hall of empty darkness. I was thinking maybe it was all just one of those weird nights where little things throw you off. But about an hour later, I saw the headlights again. Far back, just hovering like before. They kept this eerie distance, not too far, not too close, like they were waiting for something. I knew it couldn't be coincidence at this point. They'd been following me since Medicine Bow, which was miles back. That sinking feeling returned, this time worse, like a lead weight in my stomach. I started speeding up, pushing the truck harder than I usually would, just trying to shake them. Every time I looked in the mirror, those lights were still there, matching my speed. I couldn't shake them. After a while, I slowed down and they slowed down too. They were following me, and now it was obvious. I started to wonder if I was in some kind of danger. This wasn't the sort of thing that happens on a quiet stretch of Wyoming road. At some point, I saw a sign for a rest stop a few miles up and decided to pull over. As I rolled into the stop, I looked around, hoping to see maybe a cop or at least another truck. But it was deserted. The rest area had that empty, eerie feeling, just a few picnic tables and an old restroom building. I parked my rig and waited, my hand still gripping the wheel, even though I was parked. The headlights showed up moments later and stopped at the entrance to the rest area. They didn't pull in, just sat there at the edge, like they were waiting for me to make a move. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at those lights in my mirrors. Time felt stretched and weird, the minutes dragging on. I considered calling for help, but there wasn't exactly a lot of signal out there. And anyway, what would I say? That a car had been following me? It sounded paranoid, like something a rookie would get spooked by. But the longer they sat there, the more real the danger felt. This wasn't in my head anymore. After a while, the lights turned off. For a second, I thought they'd given up. But then I saw a dark shape moving from the car. Someone was getting out. The shape stayed at the edge of the rest area, a dark figure just barely visible in the dim light from my truck. They didn't approach, just stood there watching. My hand went to the gear shift, and I prepared to pull out. My heart was pounding, but I didn't move. I don't know what kept me there. Maybe the feeling that if I made the wrong move, things could go bad fast. Then just as suddenly as they'd appeared, the figure walked back to the car, got in, and drove off. I sat there, watching their taillights disappear down the road. I waited a good half hour before I felt safe to move again. But the whole drive back to Denver, I kept checking my mirrors, expecting those headlights to pop up. They didn't. When I finally reached my destination, I parked my rig, turned off the engine, and just sat there for a long time, staring out into the empty lot, trying to shake off the memory of those lights lingering behind me. It was the kind of night that sticks with you, the type that makes you think twice before trusting empty roads. I never did find out who was in that car or what they wanted. It's possible it was just some weirdo or maybe someone trying to scare me, but there was something about it that didn't feel like a prank. After that night, I started changing my routes, taking more popular highways whenever I could. The desolation that used to feel comforting now carried a kind of unease. And every time I pass through Wyoming, I can't help but remember those headlights in my mirror, hanging back in the darkness like they were just waiting for the right moment. This happened back when I was still green in the trucking world. I was fresh out of training, eager, and maybe a little too confident for my own good. I'd been assigned a high-value load to transport from San Antonio to Phoenix, and honestly, I felt proud. High-value cargo meant trust, responsibility, and honestly, a boost to my paycheck. My route was mostly long stretches of Texas highway, isolated and quiet. Just me, the road, and my rig. It felt like I had the whole world to myself, which I liked. I'd been driving for hours when I noticed a car that seemed to be lingering around me. It was nothing too suspicious at first, just a small sedan hanging around in the left lane or hovering in my blind spot. But after an hour or so, it was still there. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was being paranoid, that it was just coincidence. I was new, and seasoned truckers had always told me stories about highway paranoia, the tendency to read too much into things when you're alone out there for too long. So I let it go. Around midnight, I pulled into a rest stop. I was exhausted, and while I'd been trying to push through to my next scheduled stop, my eyelids were getting heavier by the mile. This rest stop was just a small one of those in-the-middle-of-nowhere spots that felt more like a paved patch of land than an actual rest area. I parked my rig, climbed into the sleeper cab, and set an alarm on my phone to wake me up in about an hour. The plan was a quick nap, nothing more. When I woke up, everything felt wrong. I couldn't explain it right away, but there was this strange silence, a kind of stillness that settled in my bones. I sat up and looked out the window, rubbing the sleep out of my eyes, and that's when I noticed something was off. I couldn't see my trailer. My mind was still groggy, so at first I thought I was just disoriented. I stepped out of the cab, expecting to see my trailer behind me in its place. But it wasn't there. I froze, my stomach dropping as I took in the empty space where my trailer should have been. It was gone. Just like that. This massive, high-value trailer, hooked up to my rig, had somehow disappeared without me hearing a thing. I ran around the lot, searching, hoping it was some sort of mistake or maybe I'd parked wrong. But there was nothing around, just me and a few other parked cars scattered across the rest stop. Reality hit me hard then. My trailer had been stolen, and whoever had done it had managed to disconnect it, without me even hearing a thing. I got back into my cab, my hands shaking, and called dispatch. I felt sick to my stomach, imagining what they'd think. It didn't help that this load wasn't just valuable, it was insured up to its ears, meaning the pressure was on. My boss picked up, and I explained as best as I could, my words stumbling over each other. He was pissed, obviously, but he said he'd call the police and get back to me. I waited, sitting there alone in the cab, trying to figure out how this could have happened. I kept playing the events over in my mind. Did I miss something? Could I have stopped it? I remembered that car from earlier, the one that lingered around me, and a chill went through me. It had to be them. They must have been following me, watching me the whole time, waiting for me to stop. The police finally arrived about an hour later, 2 squad cars with flashing lights cutting through the dark. They took my statement, asked questions I could barely answer because I had no idea how it happened. They told me this wasn't the first time something like this had occurred. There was a crew that targeted high-value cargo, operating along these Texas highways, tracking trucks and finding ways to disable or avoid GPS trackers on the trailers. I'd unknowingly become their next mark. The officers explained the tactics these thieves used. Apparently, they'd trail a rig, scope it out, then when the driver stopped, they'd pull up quietly, cut through the lock on the trailer hitch, and vanish into the night. They had a whole system down. Tools, timing, and experience. These weren't random thieves. This was organized. They moved fast, and they knew exactly what they were doing. I felt helpless, like my entire career had been compromised before it even started. Dispatch wasn't thrilled, obviously, and there was a strong implication that they were skeptical of my story, especially since I was new. There's this unspoken rule in trucking that trust is everything. You get assigned high-value loads because you're trusted, and here I was, already on thin ice after just one incident. The police did what they could, though I knew from their looks that they had low hopes of finding anything. They filed the report, but the officer who took my statement gave me this look, a look that said he'd seen it all before and knew that the chances were slim. He even suggested I pack up and head out because staying alone at the rest stop without my trailer wasn't a good idea. But I couldn't bring myself to leave. I was still in shock, trying to wrap my head around everything. After they left, I was alone again. The empty space where my trailer used to be felt like a wound. The silence of the deserted highway was deafening. The only sound the occasional whoosh of a passing car that barely slowed down. I was left to sit in my cab, staring at nothing, feeling the weight of my failure pressing down on me. I don't know how long I sat there, running my hand over the empty spot where the hitch had been connected, almost like I was in a trance. Eventually, dawn broke, and I could feel the exhaustion settling into my bones. I hadn't slept more than an hour, and the weight of everything was finally hitting me. Dispatch called me back, told me to return to headquarters and wait for an update. The way they said it was laced with doubt, like they weren't sure if I'd been telling the truth. I headed back, driving through that long stretch of highway with nothing around me but miles of empty land and the occasional car zooming by. The trip back felt longer than it should have. Every mile a reminder of how easily things can go wrong out here. I kept looking in my mirrors, half expecting to see that car again, trailing behind me, watching. When I got back, there was an investigation, insurance paperwork, and days of waiting to see if anything would turn up. It didn't. The trailer was gone, my reputation was in shambles, and the entire thing was deemed a loss. The company didn't say much, but I could tell they weren't thrilled. The rumors started circulating among other drivers, whispers that maybe I'd been part of it, that I'd somehow set it up or let it happen. I tried to brush it off, but it gnawed at me. I could feel the suspicion whenever I walked through the yard or talked to dispatch. Thank you for watching. If you found these stories gripping, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling content. For another hair-raising tale, check out our suggested video. And if you're hungry for more eerie encounters, dive into our playlist featuring similar chilling narratives.